Chapter 17, The Hunting of the White Stag. The battle was over after just a few minutes. Most of the enemy had been killed in the first charge of Aslan and his companions. And those who were still living saw when the witch was dead, they either gave themselves up or took flight. The next thing that Lucy knew was that Peter and Aslan were shaking hands. It was strange to see Peter looking as he looked. His face was so pale and stern, and he seemed much older. It was all Edmund's doing, Aslan, Peter was saying. We'd have been beaten if it hadn't been for him. The witch was turning our troops into stone, right and left, but nothing would stop him. He fought his way through 3 ogres to where she was just turning one of your leopards into a statue. And when he reached her, he had the sense to bring his sword smashing down on her wand, instead of trying to go directly for her and simply getting himself made into stone. That was the mistake the rest of us were making. Once her wand was broken, he began to have some chance. If we hadn't lost so many, we haven't lost all many already. He was terribly wounded. We must go and see him. They found Edmund in charge of Mrs. Beaver, a little way back from the fighting line. He was covered with blood. His mouth was open, and his face was a nasty green. Quick, Lucy, said Aslan. And then, almost for the first time, Lucy remembered the precious cordial that she'd been given as a Christmas present. Her hands trembled so much she could hardly undo the stopper, but she managed it in the end and poured a few drops in her brother's mouth. There are other people wounded, said Aslan, while she was looking eagerly into Edmund's pale face and wondering if the cordial would have had any result. Yes, I know, said Lucy. Wait a minute. Daughter of Eve, said Aslan in a graver voice. Others are also at the point of death. Must more people die for Edmund? I'm sorry, Aslan, said Lucy, getting up and going with him. And for the next half hour, they were busy, she attending the wounded while he restored those who had been turned to stone. When at last she was free to come back to Edmund, she found him standing on his feet and not only healed of his wounds, but looking better than he had seemed to look for ages, in fact, since his first term in that horrid school. He'd come to his old real self again and could look you in the eye, and then there in the field of battle, Aslan made him a knight. Does he know, whispered Lucy to Susan, what Aslan did for him? Does he know what the arrangement was with the witch? Hush, no, of course not, said Susan. Oughtn't he be told, said Lucy. Oh, surely not, said Susan. It would be too awful for him. Think of how you feel if we were he. All the same, I think he ought to know, said Lucy. But at that moment they were interrupted. That night they slept where they were. How Aslan provided food for all of them, I don't know. But somehow or other they found themselves all down on the grass to a fine high tea about 8 o'clock. Next day they began marching eastward down the east side of the river. And the next day after that, at about tea time, they actually reached the mouth. The castle of Cair Paravel on its little hill towered up above them. Before them were thousands of rocks and little pools of salt water and seaweed and the smell of the sea and the long miles of bluish-green waves breaking forever and ever on the beach. And oh, the cry of the seagulls. Have you heard it? Can you remember? That evening after tea, the 4 children all managed to get down to the beach again and get their shoes and stockings off and feel the sand between their toes. but next day was more solemn. And then in the great hall of Cair Paravel, the wonderful hall with the ivory roof and the west wall hung with peacock feathers, and the eastern door which looks towards the sea, in the presence of all their friends and the sound of trumpets, Aslan solemnly crowned them and led them to the four thrones amid deafening shouts of "Long live King Peter! Long live Susan! Long live King Edmund! Long live Queen Lucy!" Once a queen or king in Narnia, always a king or queen. "Hear it well, sons of Adam, bear it, daughters of Eve," said Aslan. And though through the eastern door, which was wide open, came the voices of mermen and mermaids swimming close to the shore and singing the honors of the new kings and queens. So the children sat on their thrones, and scepters were put in their hands, and they were rewards and honors to all their friends, to Tumas the fawn, and the beavers, and the giant Rumpelbuffin, to the leopards, to the good centaurs, and the good dwarfs, and the lion. And that night there was a great feast in Cair Paravel, and revelry and dancing, and gold flashed, and wine flowed, and answering to the music inside were strangers sweeter and more piercing, the cry and the music of the sea people. But amid all these rejoicing, Aslan himself slipped away. And when the kings and queens noticed that he wasn't there, they said nothing about it. For Mr. Beaver had warned them. "He'll be coming and going," he said to them. "One day you'll see him, another you won't. He doesn't like being tied down, and of course he has other countries to attend to. It's quite all right. He'll often drop in. Only you mustn't press him. He's wild, you know. He's not a tame lion." And now, as you see, this story is nearly, but not quite at the end. These two kings and two queens governed Narnia well, and long and happy was their reign. At first, much of the time was spent in seeking out the remnants of the White Witch's army and destroying them, and indeed the long time it took to dispense with the evil things lurking in the wilder parts of the forest. A haunting there, a killing there, a glimpse of a wolf one month, and the rumor of a hag the next. But in the end, all the foul brood were stamped out. And they made good laws, and kept the peace, and saved good trees from being unnecessarily cut down, liberated a young dwarf and a young sarters as being sent to school, and generally stopped busybodies and interferers and encouraged ordinary people who wanted to live and let live. And they drove back the fierce giants, quite a different sort than giant Rumpelbuffin, on the north of Narnia when they ventured to cross the frontier. And they entered into friendship and alliance with countries beyond the sea, and paid them visits of state and received visits of state from them. And they themselves grew and changed as the years passed over them. Peter became a tall and deep-chested man and a great warrior, and he was called King Peter the Magnificent. And Susan grew into a tall and gracious woman with hair that almost fell to her feet. And the kings of countries beyond the sea began to send ambassadors asking for her hand in marriage. And she was called Susan the Gentle. Edmund was a graver and quieter man than Peter, and great in counsel and judgment. He was called King Edmund the Just. But as far as Lucy, she was always gay and golden-haired, and all princes in all parts desired her to be their queen. And her people called her Queen Lucy the Valiant. Excuse me. So they lived in great joy, and even remembered their life in the world. It was only just remembers as one would remember a dream. In one year it fell out, Tumnus, who was the middle-aged fawn by then, and coming rather stout, came down river and brought with him news that the white stag had once more appeared in his parts. The white stag who would give you wishes if you caught him. So these two kings and two queens, with principal members of their court, rode a hunting with horns and hounds in the western woods to follow the white stag. They had not hunted long where they found the sight of him, and he led them at great pace over rough and smooth and through thick and thin, till the horses of all the courtiers were tired out. Only those four were still following. And they saw the stag enter the thicket where the horses could not follow. Then said King Peter, they talk quite differently from this style now, having been kings and queens for long. Fair consorts, let us now alight from our horses and follow the beast into the thicket. For in all my days I have never hunted a nobler quarry. Sir, said the others, even so let us do. So they alighted and tied their horses to the trees and went on to the thick wood on foot. And as soon as they entered, Queen Susan said, Fair friends, here is a great marvel, for I seem to have found a tree of iron. Madam, said King Edmund, if you look well upon it, you shall see the pillar of iron with the lantern set upon the top thereof. By the lion's mane, a strange device, said King Peter, to set a lantern out here where the trees cluster so thick about it and so high above it that if it were lit, it would give light to no man. Sir, said Queen Lucy, by likelihood then this post and this lamp were set here there when the trees were smaller, or fewer, or none. For this is a young wood, and the iron post is old. And they stood looking upon it, and then said King Edmund, I know not how it is, but the lamp of the post worketh upon me strangely. It runs in my mind that I have seen like before, as if it were in a dream, or a dream of a dream. Sir, answered they all, it is even so with us. And more, said Queen Lucy, for it will not go out of my mind that if we pass the post and lantern, either we shall find strange adventures, else some great change for our fortunes. Madam, said King Edmund, the like foreboding stirreth in my heart also. And in mine, fair brother, said King Peter. And in mine too, said Queen Susan. Wherefore, by my counsel, we shall lightly return to our horses and follow the white stag no further. Madam, said King Peter, therein I pray you'll have me excused, for never since we four were kings and queens in Narnia have we set our hands to any high matters, as battles, quests, feats of arms, acts of justice, and the like, and then given over, but always we have taken what is at hand, and the same we have achieved. Sister, said Queen Lucy, my loyal brother speaks rightly, and it seems to me we should be shamed for have any fear or foreboding that we lack for following so noble a beast as we have it come to chase. And so say I, said King Edmund. I have such a desire to find the signification of this thing. I would not be my good will to turn back and the richest jewel in Narnia and all the islands. Then in the name of Aslan, said Queen Susan, if he will all have to it so, let us go, and the adventure and shall fall to us. And so the kings and queens entered the thicket. And before they had gone a score of paces, they all remembered the thing they had seen that was called a lamp post And before they had gone 20 more, they noticed that they were making their way not through branches, but through coats. And next moment they all came tumbling out of the wardrobe into the empty room, and they were no longer kings and queens in hunting array, but just Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy in their old clothes. It was the same day and the same hour of the day in which they had gone into the wardrobe to hide. Mrs. McCready and the visitors were still talking in the passage, but luckily they had never come into the empty room, and so the children weren't caught. And that would have been the very end of the story if it hadn't been for they felt they really must explain to the professor why 4 of the coats were missing in the wardrobe. And the professor was a very remarkable man, didn't tell them not to be silly or not to tell lies, but believed the whole story. No, he said, I don't think it would be a good thing to go back through the wardrobe door to get the coats. You won't get into Narnia again by that route. Nor would the coats be of much use now. What's that? Yes, of course you'll get back into Narnia again someday. Once a king in Narnia, always a king in Narnia. But don't go trying to use the same route twice. And indeed, don't try to get in there at all. It'll happen when you're not looking for it. And don't talk too much about it, even among yourselves, and don't mention it to anyone. You find that they've had unless they've had adventures of the same sort. What's that? How will you know? Oh, you'll know all right. Odd things, they say, even their looks will let the secret out. Keep your eyes open. Bless me, what do they teach in those schools? That's the very end of the adventure of the wardrobe, but the professor was right. It's only the beginning of the adventures of Narnia.